Hello and welcome everyone on the Information Technology and Service Management PECB webinars. My name is Vler Arshala, the PECB organizer of this webinar, and today's topic is ISO 31000 Centralized Operations, Risk, Control and Compliance. This session will be presented by Mr. Steve Tremblay. Mr. Tremblay is Executive ITSM Consultant and Trainer at ExcelsaTech Technology and PECB Certified Trainer. Please write your question and comments in the question box in the right hand control panel, or you may use the option to raise your hand, and Mr. Tremblay will answer to them accordingly in the end of this presentation. Please, Mr. Tremblay, you may start the presentation.
Thank you very much. So welcome everyone to that short presentation. So it's going to be about 30 minutes. I'll make sure to keep at least close to 5 minutes at the end for any questions you may have. And without further ado, let's start that presentation. So that was for the introduction that was just made. So you have my information here. You will have access to that presentation. So if you can't remember exactly those phone number and email address, you could have it once you get a copy of that presentation after that session. So that shouldn't be a problem. And that is if you want to reach me for any follow-on questions. So this is the agenda for today. I'll start with just covering briefly risk management and what it is, a brief overview of the standard ISO 31000 as well, as this standard has been written specifically on the subject of risk management in a general sense as well, so applying to any type of domain. Then we'll get to the heart of the subject here, centralized operation models. I'll cover the benefit case of why there's some importance there in relationship with risk, and then some options as well for managing risk controls and compliance in a setup of a centralized operation. And then I'll conclude the presentation afterwards. So what is risk, really? So when we talked about risk, we talked about those effects of uncertainty on objectives. We talked about the probability that an event could occur, and specifically the consequences of that event. So that's what we mean when we talked about risk. Now, we have a train here, multiple tracks. It's a passenger train, so many wagons as well. So if we assess the situation here, and we assess the traffic flow on these tracks, we would determine potentially a risk associated with that. And the typical risk is that, well, we could derail because potentially we assess that the tracks weren't so well maintained, or they were quite old and so on. And then the consequences are associated with what could happen. In this case, just a derailment of one wagon. But it could have been that it's an accident with another train that was coming on the same track, which would have been more dangerous and would have had more implications. Now, if we look at this situation here, somewhat similar, still dealing with train, multiple tracks, but if you look at the type of wagons, now we're not carrying people anymore. We're carrying potential explosive or inflammable, highly inflammable material. And then so the situation will vary quite a lot. Now, if we assess the risk, we know that the risk could be similar, but they could be quite different. And in this case here, well, that could be as tragic as this. So no lives on board that train. But if there were to have an accident of that train in a rural or where there's houses in a village or a city, well, that's what we see that could be the consequences of that accident with that specific train. So again, each situation, each sets of different risks that could be associated with it, and consequences as well. And it's important to, again, really assess the situation. So we saw a smaller train. We could see that the second example had way more wagons in that train. And yes, there was a centralization that was done of those wagons into one single train. And, well, the risk by the same measure as well. So how do we deal with risk? Well, you should be all pretty much aware of the typical or the classical four here that we have. So the risk reduction, so actions that we would take to really lessen the probability of negative consequences or both associated with risks. So that is when we will put in place some mitigation strategies to try to limit the consequences of those risks, the negative consequences. Risk avoidance, when we decide not to be involved or we withdraw from the risk situation. Risk retention is when we accept the acceptance of the burden of loss or the benefits that we could have are facing that specific risk or these specific risks. And in some cases, it might be just acceptable as reducing or avoiding. And the last one is the risk transfer. So that's when we work to be sharing with another party the burden of the loss or the benefits gained from a risk. And I just mentioned here the benefit, because keep in mind that when we deal with risk, we're talking about negative consequences, but we're talking about positive consequences as well. So that is a possibility, and some organizations use risk and their positive consequences to their benefit to grow even more. So keep that in mind, that this is still also a possibility here. So that is what is risk. And as we could see, depending on the situation, single isolated type of model versus a model that integrates multiple parts, such as that train there with multiple quantity of those wagons, and each one of them with a different level of risk as well. It could have been a train that is composed of wagons of some explosives, some inflammable, some normal, whatsoever. But the integration of all of this together does change the perspective on risks. So let's go through just a brief overview of the ISO 31000 standard on risk management per se. I don't want to go and detail you the exact detail of that standard, but I want to make sure that you have an understanding of what you would find if you were to go and buy that standard, or maybe obtain training as well. So these are the clauses of the standard. So when we talked about an ISO standard, the different sections of the standards are called clauses, and there's some really specific and common clauses at the beginning, such as the scope of the standard and the terms and definitions, which we have in that standard as well. And then we get to the meat of the standard, and you could see it here starting at clause 3, where we have the principles of that standard. And when we talk about principles, they're guiding statements on how we should approach risks. Now, we won't see those principles, I won't go through them, but some of those principles are such as, do we have a risk that is an integral part of the organizational processes? Because risk must be at the organizational level. It cannot just be managed as like simple cells all across our organization. It has to be managed from an integral perspective. Is risk part of decision making? Is it systematic, structured, and timely as well? Is it based on best available information? Is it tailored to our organization as well? Do we take human and cultural factors into account? So these are the type of principles you have in that standard. And there's about 10 or 12 that if you go over and then you review based on that knowledge what you have in your organization, you could definitely supplement your position with regards to risk for your organization by adopting some of those principles, in fact. Then we have the framework, clause 4. So we'll talk about that one. I'll have a slide on the framework, and I'll have a slide as well on the process, just to show you the foundation on how ISO has seen the concept of risk management. And you will see that it shouldn't be much different than what you know, whether you're working in security, whether you're working on the business side or purely on the IT side. The way that you've dealt with risk up to now probably comes to some degree based on the foundation of this ISO standard, as this standard has been the foundation for many risk management best practices around the world. There's also an Annex A that consists of attributes of enhanced risk management. So a little bit more details there, more in-depth guidance on the risk management process. So a valuable, quite valuable standard to get access to. So here we see the framework. Again, mandate and commitment at the top. So really what is driving or what should be driving your framework, your risk management framework within your organization. And you could see that, well, we have a first major activity that is the design of that framework for managing risks that must align with what is the organization trying to achieve, what is the vision of the organization, how we operate, where we operate, and so on, so our full picture. Then we can implement risk management once we've defined on how we are planning to manage it. And that means that we've identified all the risks and so on. We have potential mitigation strategies. We have ownerships or risks and whatsoever. And then that brings us to a state where we can be now acting at monitoring and reviewing the performance of the framework. And if that framework over time needs to change, then we have to fill in back to that first box through the control improvement box here of the framework and try to further align it to either its mandate or commitment that has changed, or based on information that we've monitored and reviewed and detected that needs to change. So what is risk management? So we saw what was risk. When we talked about risk management, we're talking about, as you see here, the activities, the coordinated activities that are required so that we can direct and control the organization with regards to risk. So we have identified risks. We need to be able to manage these risks. That means that they may occur, and if they occur, there will be consequences, either negative or positive, and we need to be ready to react to these consequences. Whether we had mitigation strategies, whether we transferred the risk with a third party, or whether we just accepted them. The fact that we accept them means that we won't have potentially mitigation strategies, but we have something. We have a knowledge of that probability or that possibility that that risk occur, and at that time we're already predisposed to better react to that situation than not having identified that possible risk. So risk management is that practice where we will then make sure that we build that framework on how to manage and deal with risks and also implement those processes that are required to manage risk properly. And this is the process as it is defined in Clause 5. So you could see that based on the context, we will have our risk assessment a set of activities that will take place, risk identification, we analyze those risks, we evaluate them, and then based on that evaluation, we'll have risk treatments. That could be any of the four that we saw before. On the right side here, you could see that all along we have our monitoring and reviewing activities, but on the left side, we also have something that is quite important, and it's the communication and consultation as well. So as we do go through those different activities, we need to be communicating with the right parties, and we need to consult as well to make sure that we have all the information we need and that we do provide the best plans or the best way to react to those risks. So let's get now into those centralized operation models, shared services, and specifically in more an IT type of perspective, possibly. But it could apply to any type of situation as well, or domain of expertise. Keep that in mind, because as we look at it, you could have a hat of being in IT, or you could have a hat of being in any other domain, whether it's HR or finance or sales or whatsoever. And these concepts do apply the same way. So we know that, as this slide is showing here, that is the situation right now over the world. We're in a global economic type of uncertainty since several years now, and it comes into cycles, and we get through cost reductions, and we need to look at managing risks as we do get through these, because we know that as we cut costs, we cut people potentially, we cut resources, other types of resources, and that changes our model of operating, and that changes our risk exposure as well. So centralized operations become that obvious and sometimes quite tempting options where when we have those reductions, we're trying to reposition ourselves to be stronger, where most organizations are going to try to go towards. And that means that it could save us, it could make us better. But that also means that we have to reassess properly risk and what type of controls we need to have in place and how are we going to confirm our compliances as well once we have those models defined. So organizations are already required to manage multiple of challenges, and that links to the previous slide. We know, I'm sure you're pretty much affected by one of these. Slow growth in your market, challenging to realize the full growth potential that in fact you had expected. The price volatility as well, that is really common in many sectors. Again, not only IT, but every one of them. The threat that are presented to us or opportunities with regards to technology nowadays. This is nonstop, and it's not going to stop tomorrow, and it's only going to change faster and faster. So we need to be able to deal with that. So one common response for a lot of organizations, as I just touched before, is that aspect of centralizing operation. So again, either in shared services or different types of operating model, offshoring your services, co-sourcing or with third parties, or in some cases outsourcing partly or entirely to third parties as well. So these are common responses. So that need to centralize there to try to recover and come back with a solution that will sustain our operation with regards to the potential cost reduction that has been inflicted on our organization becomes our reality. And then that means that, well, as people that would be involved in managing risk, and implementing the proper controls and validating those compliances, we need to be able to cope with that. I mean, whether we were or not accepting that in the past, this is a reality, and you can't work against it, you have to work with it. And that is if you want to be able to get through it properly and manage to succeed as an organization. So the tendency there is, or the trend is that centralization. But from our perspective of risk, as I mentioned, we need to manage to maintain that status quo there. We need to manage to maintain the proper level of risk and make sure that we have the proper controls in place, whether we are centralized or decentralized or in any of those models that we saw before. And if we don't do that, then we're putting our organization at higher level of risk, a situation where it won't be controlled and we may run into major issues. So the benefit case here, so as I touched before, shared services, whether they're national, so across our country, or they're just regional within one single region, whether we use the model of offshore, where we transfer, in fact, activities from operating units to new centralized locations that are offshore where we mainly operate, the hub and spoke, so again, transfer of low risk and documentation intensive activities to new centralized locations, locations again, offshore center, independent completely of our operating units. So high risk activities and those requiring personal interactions as well could be considered as well. So that is all activities that we need to make sure that we're going to assess and make sure that we deal properly with them. And again, it can be outsourced or co-sourced. So in the first part, it is really within our organization. But in the second part of that slide here, it can be that it goes to other legal organizations as well, either fully or again as a co-source, so a shared model there, but still an external organization. And the benefits, well, they're quite obvious. I mean, the cost, as I just mentioned before, but to some degree, risk management and compliance as well. So from a risk and compliance, I mean, to achieve that centralization of risk control and compliance activities, that requires a common and clearly articulated set of risks and regulatory requirements as well for all of the processes and activities that will be within the scope of that new operating model. And we have to make sure that we manage that properly. And if we do it well, we are going to help ourselves. Scalability, so again, centralization of, if we specifically concentrate on risk control and compliance, that has an inherent ability here to better absorb changes over the organization. If we don't do that work properly on the risk and control and compliances, it's going to be hard to move. But if we do it properly when we do a centralized operation, then we contribute to be also more scalable, just like the other part of the organization. Agility, somewhat related as well. But again, those controls, those risks, those compliance needs is enhanced through that more centralized operating model. And again, if it's concentrated for some degree to one single part, then it becomes more agile if we need to modify it or change it. So if we took it from several different areas of organization and we centralized it, well, that's somewhat of a benefit there. And then the last one, transparency. Well, when you do centralized operation, whether it's within your organization or with external entities, you're going to have like some kind of agreements, whether they're service level agreements or they're formal contracts. And by having those agreements brings a level of details there that will be more formalized and standardized on reporting and will contribute to better management to some degree if you do it properly on risk controls and compliances as well. So options for managing risk controls and compliances in a centralized operation. Again, the idea is to have the right operating model specifically for risk control and compliances. So again, as I said, we cannot go against organizational decisions to centralize. We have to work with that decision and make sure that we will properly identify what are the specific activities that have to be involved, that will be involved in that centralization. What are those capabilities that are involved? And then we need to look at what and how it will operate within the different part of the organization within that new model of operations. And that will ensure that, in fact, we consider all aspects and we do provide that proper risk framework, the risk management framework that needs to be in place so that we do ultimately have a good management of risk, good control is in place, and we still maintain that compliances capability as well. So pretty much last content slide here on that presentation, and it's a busy slide, I agree with you, but it's to show the overall footprint really when we're talking about risk controls and compliances. You will recognize, well, the typical approach of assessing, improving, and monitoring, very much in line with the standard we saw before. And then from all levels, going from the strategic level all the way down to operational, looking at the finance and compliancy as well, these have to be maintained. So we have to maintain that through our new operating model. And on this, the more center part of that slide, what I showed is what we have on a day-to-day basis. So our operations and business units, that is all of these listed there, that's our first line of defense. So if any of these are decentralized, we have to assess what can be decentralized and what can't from a risk and control and compliancy perspective. So there are some parts that we'll be able to. One thing for sure is that the ownership, before we get to that point of decentralizing some of those aspects, the ownership of defining and assessing risk and compliance requirements should not be delegated. From an operation model, yes, we can to some degree. The second part is our second line of defense, and that's the management assurance function. And from that perspective, we should make sure that from an internal control and compliance and risk, the design remains within the business. That is quite important. There are some parts that can be transferred to other parties, assessment, monitoring of risk, some of the controls as well and the compliances operation to some degree, but the design has to stay within. And that assures you a certain level of control, and that's the idea here. We keep control by keeping the ownership, We keep control now, as you can see, by promoting the design, and then the rest can be, to some degree, delegated. The third line of defense is the independent assurance function, so internal and external audits. So again, from that perspective, we have to make sure that we've maintained that design, and then some other aspects of those audits could, to some degree, be delegated. There is an independence that has to be maintained. So again, the reporting can be remaining within the audit and risk committee, but it is quite often seen that internal and external audit could be outsourced, and that's quite common for the external audits, and it becomes more and more common with the internal audit as well. On the right side, you see all the different typical committees that we have, and that oversight is that where we can close the loop. That's the accountability for risks, and that cannot be delegated. You have to keep that. So in a centralized model of operation, you have to make sure that you're going to be able to close your loop, so that oversight, that accountability has to stay within your organization. So from an operating part of it, how the information will be collected and all that, that's fine. But in the end, you have to be able to close the loop. So that concludes that short presentation here. Again, dealing effectively with risk will ensure better sustainability of your organization. Every organization should really consider what types of risk assessment are relevant to its objectives. If the objectives then of the organization changes, then we know that we have to reassess the risk. We have to go back and look at all those factors and come up with a new strategy on how we're going to deal with risk, how we need to have that model of controls in place, and how we will also assess the compliancy to that new model. And in a model where you're going to centralize your operations, that's even more critical because as I hope I've defined to you, there are more to consider when we start to centralize and put all our eggs in the same basket. And that will require more complex activities with regards to assessing risk and managing risk properly, and that ownership of risks as well. So all the way down to the risk treatments that will be in place, they will vary, they will change, and the model we had before do not necessarily apply again. So as we saw with the major framework recommended by ISO 31000 and its process, it has to be done in a closed loop. Something changes, then we need to reassess, readjust our model, and that will ensure that we do a good job in managing risks. So that is the end of our presentation. I'll open the floor in just about a minute. I'll just go to the end with the last few slides that are there. They're just concluding slides here. So again, PECB offers a training on ISO 31000 at the introduction level, foundation, and all the way to really lead risk manager level. So there's quite a few options there. And who we are, well, ExcelsaTech Technologies Consulting. We're based in Canada. We operate on a global perspective, and our concentration is really on process reengineering, so helping organizations to do better from a quality perspective of their operations. And we specialize in information technology service management, but more and more we're working with customers on a service management perspective, so in other field of IT, as it is exactly the same idea. And we supplement this by training as well. So we work with multiple best practices and ISO standards to try to help organizations to do better and improve the quality of their service management practices. So I'll open the floor to any questions you may have, and I'll do my best with the time remaining to answer these.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tremblay, for this highly informative presentation. And as we have some time left, we will go through some questions. The first question is what's the difference between the first and second line of defense?
Yes, the first line of defense, as I explained it, is our operational units. So that's really where we have, where we define, in fact, our controls and compliances activities that are needed. That's where we're going to operate the controls and compliances procedures, but that's where also we remediate for control failures and compliancy breaches. So that's the day-to-day operation. And as you could see, there's a portion of definition and there's a portion of operating and remediating. So the definition we should be careful when we delegate this, and the other ones, to some degree, we can centralize that or delegate that. Second line of defense is where we are going to look at the aspects, and I'll go back if you don't mind. It'll be easier for me to explain that, and to visualize for all of you. So I'll go back to that slide. I think it'll be better since you don't have a copy of that slide there. So that's the management assurance functions. So that's the management of those internal controls and the compliances of those risks. And to some degree, yes, the design part of it, as I mentioned before, we need to keep it, but we could delegate to some degree that compliancy, that validation, or those monitoring to some degree as well. And the last part is those formal second party or third party type of audits, internal or externals, that we need to have in place as well to concentrate on the compliancy perspective. And what I mentioned to that is, as I mentioned before, is that we have to make sure that we remain in control of these assessments, but the execution of those assessments can then be done in a centralized model or to some degree by third parties as well. So that's the three lines of defense that we have within an organization. So that's how a typical organization operates nowadays. So we have our design, we have our strategy, we have our operation. That's where we put that in place and we operate and run with it. And then we monitor those controls. And then lastly, we have that other party that comes and validate that what we said we were going to do, we're doing it. And if it doesn't work well, that we're also taking the actions to correct this. So I hope that I clarified those what I call line of defenses here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tremblay. Another question is, how do you bring the complexity of risk management to an understandable employee awareness?
Yeah, there's one single way to do that, and well, not one single way, but there's multiple things that needs to be done, but it all boils down to communication. We talked about the framework before and the process, and we saw that communication and consultation. We need to be able to understand exactly where we stand, what we're trying to achieve. So we need to have linkages there to the different stakeholders. And then that means that we need to go and identify those stakeholders, and we need to know what they have into that model. What are they expecting to extract from this overall model that is our organization? And then we have to look at it from the perspective of risk management. Once we define those solutions, then it's important to go back and communicate back to those different stakeholders. And when I say stakeholders, that means internal customers group, internal users, that means the directions, the upper, the middle, that means everyone, that means external parties as well, partners, regulator bodies, name it. So all of these, they're all stakeholders, and we need to connect and know exactly what are the overall picture. And then once we've agreed with the potential situations that we need to have in place on how we're going to manage a risk, then what's important is communication again, and we need to make sure that people are aware of what are the implications within their own sphere of responsibility. So that means having awareness sessions, having training sessions, having different kind of marketing campaign to make sure that we raise the level of awareness vis-a-vis of the risk aspect, the risk management aspect. And that means going to reach out to different groups of the organization to sometimes fine-tune awareness sessions that will go specifically for our IT support group, that will go specifically to our security IT group, or specifically to our sales group, and so on. So the goal is to reach the stakeholders the way that is best to them. And so when we talk about communication, that means knowing who they are, how best to communicate with them, as well as that message we need to communicate to them. And that's really the secret here.
Thank you, Mr. Tremblay. And the next one is, how to be ensure we have an independent risk management and audit team, and how important is that?
How to ensure that we have a proper risk management team in place?
Yeah, and audit team, yeah. Independent risk management and audit team.
Yes. You see two factors here on that slide that are quite important from that perspective, I would say, and that's what we have as ownership and oversight. So that team in a centralized model may endow that, yes, it's going to be potentially centralized somewhere within the organization or to some degree, as we saw, outside of the organization. Well, we still have to make sure that that team, whether it's centralized within or outside, that we have an ownership that directs that team on how to operate, how to execute, how to do their work from a risk management perspective. And then we have to conclude as well with that oversight over that team, whether it's a centralized or decentralized partly, or as I mentioned, centralized within or without outside of our organization. And these are important aspects. And that's why I mentioned those aspects of lines of defense. And as I also highlighted, that design aspect there stays within our own centralized control as well. And that's because you need to be able to define your model of managing risk and then the resources that are required to manage risks. And when I say resources, it's in a large sense. That's the people, yes, the team that we're talking here, but that's all of what goes with it too as well. Whether the policies or principles that needs to be in place or control mechanism or whatsoever or reporting and all that. So the ownership, we maintain that, we design it, we then look at how it's going to be operating and with the right mechanism to manage and control that operation, and then we keep that oversight of being able to close that loop and look and confirm that yes, this is operating properly. And naturally the control or that management will vary based on how we operate from a centralized perspective. So depending on the model, it will vary. And yes, we have to be aware that if it's within our organization, it's going to be easier, more easy to manage as if it's fully decentralized and potentially to an outside entity as well. But through the contracting mechanism that we have in place with those outsourced parties or those third parties, that's how we can manage to maintain that control over those teams. And that's what we call the ownership and the oversight. Ownership of it, designed through a contract, they operate, and we validate with that oversight that they operate the way that we said that they need to operate. Okay?
Thank you very much. Another question is, one of attendees has asked you if you can mention some examples of a financial risk. Well, financial perspective, I mean, depending again of the operations that we have, but if we have a centralized model of operation where we did take some back office type of functions and we put that in a centralized location, and if on top of that it's also an external party, some financial risks would be that in fact it goes over what we allocated as a cost on an annual basis for this. And if we did that to save costs because we don't have those monies anymore, we want to control those types of risk quite closely, because that may mean that in fact we do fail as an organization. So if we set up a contract with that centralized back office operation, we want to make sure that we're fully well covered with that contract, that we are not going to have surprises at the end of that contract where in fact our third party is coming back with additional costs that we didn't forecast, and now we're stuck in a situation where we cannot absorb these costs. There's the financial aspect of risk that related to the financial or the cost that goes with the laws that comes and that have an influence on us as well. Depending on what functions are exactly centralized and potentially outsourced, we know that from a financial perspective, depending on the countries we operate, there are laws that tells you that for some records, financial records, you need to keep them for 5, for 7, for 10 years, depending on those types of financial records. Well, you have to make sure that you can manage these as well. So if those functions are delegated or outsourced, well, they have then by extension, if they operate in line with your country's operation, although they're in another country, they may have to follow those same rules. And so those financial risk and controls have to be passed through your contract to these parties as well.
And that has to be captured, because if you don't, then you may be in trouble as an organization. So these are two examples here.
Thank you very much. Another question is how ISO 31000 is associated with ISO 9001?
Well, ISO 9001 is, as we call it, because I do sit on the boards of ISO as well for several of those standards, 20,000, governance 38500. I was involved with the ISO 9001. 9001 is what we call the mother quality standard. That's the standard that applies across the board and says what should be in place from a quality perspective. Now, if we talk about quality, then we could extend by going to how do we do that in a service management model where there's an ISO 20000 that exists that will specifically go in that field. How do we do for security from a quality perspective? Well, we have an ISO 27001 standard that does that specifically for security. And then if we want to know how do we ensure a high level of quality specifically with regards to risk, well, then we have ISO 31000. And there's a couple of other sub-standards as well in that series of risk management standards that can help as well. And so these standards, 20,000, 27,001, that 31,000, they're somewhat child standards that go into a specific areas of quality, but fully in line with the ISO 9000 standard. And there's other ones as well. If you work in environment, there's 14,001, which is again a quality management standard, but specifically for environments. So that's taking the guidance of the 9001 and applying it specifically to how to preserve the environments. So that's how the relationship goes between the 31,000 to 9001 and some similar other standards as well.
Thank you, Mr. Steve. Another question is how can ISO 31000 help IT departments in IT compliance management?
Well, if you recall the process that I shown before, you could see that the standard depict a framework and a full process. And then the process goes all the way down to closing the loop. So it's not just about knowing what we need to protect and what are those potential risks, but it goes down to doing that full analysis, that full assessment, and come up with those treatments. So those mitigation strategies or some kind of strategies that we will have to have in place to deal with risks. And as we get down there, then we've identified those controls. And then on the right side, as you recall, we had the monitoring activities that were there. And these activities, and I'll bring the slide as I'm talking about that, these activities are there for ensuring that we have that proper monitoring in place where we need to ensure that compliancy there. And if those activities are not done, then we cannot contribute to that compliancy there. So compliancy means looking at how things are done based on how we said that they were supposed to be done. And it's looking as well as, yes, we're doing it, but is it effective as well? And is it meeting the requirements, the basic requirements that we've set part of our framework? And if it does, then we do a good job. If it doesn't, then that's when the loop goes back. And as you see it here, you see it going back to the top, and we reestablish the context. So in a case where we found out that some of the criteria weren't managed properly from a risk perspective during our compliance evaluation, then we feed that back into our context, and then that will affect on how now we do our risk assessment. And that will fine-tune on how we should have or what we should have as a risk treatment in the future. And then optimally, that will get in place, and then our next set of monitoring activities and reviewing, so validating that compliancy will then determine that, yeah, now we corrected it and it's working fine. So feedback goes to the top with no more requirement for adjustments. So it's a closed loop process. And as you can see, this is like heavily based on the concepts, again, of the 9001, which is based on the concepts of planning, doing, checking, and acting in a continuous model.
Thank you very much. Now we are going to get to last questions. Can centralization of operation be applied in regard to information security management?
Well, the centralization can be applied to that as well. I don't personally see too much limitation of the specific domain that can be or cannot be centralized. And when we talk about information security, yes, to some degree, we can look at centralizing that domain of activities as well. Now, when we talked about this, we have to be conscious of all of what are the regulations or requirements that are above this. And yes, we're going to have to deal with these. So if we talk about information security and we operate in one single country, whether it's Canada or the US or a European country or Asian countries, if we operate locally or in another model we operate globally, there will be different requirements that are in place, and we have to keep these in place or keep them in mind and consider them in our framework. And that may mean that to some degree, depending on our model of operation, we can centralize some, but some we can't. And then that all boils down to that risk assessment again at the beginning. And from the perspective of the risk, that's our job to recommend to the business when some people may come up and say, well, that's a good idea, let's centralize all of that these pieces of information within that third party. Well, our job is to highlight what are the risks based on the overall situation. So we need to be aware of all of those requirements, and then we need to be aware of what are the potential risks associated with that new model of operation, and then bring that up so that it can be considered along with potential risk treatments. And if there's no risk treatments possible, and that changes our risk posture, and if it's way above what is tolerable for the organization, then these activities are going to be blocked and they're not going to go ahead logically. If it is within tolerance, then they could still go and decentralize. And that's the activity of risk here with working with the business. And that could apply with that perspective as well. But we need to look at all of what are those external and internal influences on what we're trying to achieve, whether it's information, whether it's finance, whether it's purely execution and operation of support or delivery activities.
Thank you very much. What kind of strategies should be adopted if management do not truly buy into risk management?
I think that a strategy that is good for people working specifically in risk is to go by example or association. If you do your job and within your domain of expertise you see that the organization is really in a bad posture with regards to risk, I would say that you could use potential examples that exist publicly of similar organizations that have done that same mistakes and what were the impacts and the repercussions of such situations. So you could bring that in perspective to the business side of your organization and show what really happened and what that caused not to look carefully at the risk aspect. The other aspect is that you have to be able to do your homework properly. You have to know exactly what is the business trying to achieve, and based on that context, what are the exact risks that are present to us now, and what are the potential impacts of those risks, whether it's positive or negative. Keep in mind that both sides needs to be assessed here, because when we do our assessment, we do it for the survival of the organization. Survival may be to mitigate those negative consequences or to build on those positive risks as well. And it's based again on that communication and consultation with the business. They need to be aware, they need to understand it. And if we can describe it so that they understand it enough, that also is not going to work well. So we need to provide that message, and then as I mentioned, you could supplement it by some concrete examples that exist that occurred and that could demonstrate on how it worked well or how it didn't work so well for other similar organizations. And that's how you may get the buy-in and then the organization as a whole to decide to, okay, let's be serious about managing risk then properly.
Mr. Steve, thank you very much. I said that those are going to be two last questions, but we are having also more questions, and I think it's better to answer now. Another question is, do we have to ignore asset value in process-based risk assessment as per ISO 31000?
ISO 31000 doesn't go too specific about the asset value, but it goes about the protection of assets. And yes, by extension, when we protect the asset or any asset, we have to look at all perspective of that asset, whether it's what it is used for, who's using it, what environment it will be used, or its value, monetary value, but value as well to the organization as an asset for what we're trying to achieve on our operation side. So yes, this is in scope of the process of the framework of the risk management as presented within the ISO 31000.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, operational level agreement helps with IT processes management. And the question is, how do we monitor compliance on operational level agreement?
Well, whether we talk about an operational level agreement or a service level agreement or a contractual agreement, the foundation is the same. We have to set the requirements of that agreement, and then we have to set up performance measurements. And so any type of agreements, we have to have these. And then how we're going to do those performance measurements will depend. Naturally, you want to automate as much as possible, but it's true, monitoring, whether it's automated monitoring or people will review specific activities or documents or results, and then we're going to assess if they meet the requirements that we've identified at first, and if they don't, then we readjust. So you have no choice, even with the OLAs or operational level agreements, you have to measure it the same way that you measure an SLA, where it's going to be from a customer perspective satisfaction ultimately, but from an OLA, it will be indirectly to link to that, but it will be directly linked to how those operational level groups are going to be working well together. And you need to measure that and monitor it and manage that it is working as we expected all along as well. If I may add, we've extended quite a bit, so I could still answer maybe another question, but maybe for the remaining we'll have to do it through email. I know we've done that in the past because I have another meeting starting soon.
Yeah, Mr. Steve, thank you very much. We don't have any other question. And I want to thank you again for this great presentation and answering the question. I think that all these questions are very good indicator that this presentation was very good and effective. I want to thank all the attendees as well for taking the time out of your busy schedule and join us. We hope you enjoyed this webinar, and you can watch this session recorded and view the presentation slides on our website www.pcb.com. In the end, I just want to inform you that next Monday we are hosting another webinar titled 7 Tips to Raise the Awareness of ISO 22301 in your organization. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
And again, feel free to reach out to me if you have more questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Mr. Steve. Bye-bye.